Good evening and welcome to the APORDE Development Dialogue. We're very happy to see all of you, both those of you who are here in person and those online. My name is Mwangi Gĩthĩnji, and I will be coordinating this panel tonight, which is on gender, work, and digitalization, the case of e-hailing drivers in Nairobi. The panel is about negotiating minimum labor standards for the platform economy. The questions of how to extend labor protection to platform workers without undermining their individual and collective power has emerged as a core question as member states of the International Labour Organization begin negotiations on minimum labor standards. Drawing on the case of e-hailing workers in Kenya, the seminar explores the contradictions of making workers legible for regulation and the challenges of extending labor protection to workers who embody contradictory class locations. Ultimately, the authors are going to argue the worker is a gendered political category rather than a fixed technical classification. I look forward to this conversation because for a long time, issues of class and how do you define class, given the many roles that people play, even in the productive sector, have been central to my own work. Joining us to give us this presentation today are Sivwe Muhalana, who is a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of the Witwatersrand. Her work focuses on informality, tax justice, social reproduction, and gender. She serves on the board of the Institute for Economic Justice and is a research associate in the Department of Economics and Economic History at Rhodes University. She holds an MA in Social Policy and Labor Studies from Rhodes University and is currently completing her PhD at SOAS, University of London. Joining her will be Ruth Castel Branco, who is a senior lecturer at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, University of the Witwatersrand. Her research is focused on the casualization of labor, worker organizing, and the redistributive role of the state. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of the Witwatersrand. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much, Mwangi, for the introduction. But before I begin, I was speaking to Ruth earlier, and I was saying that it's such an honor to be presenting this topic today, because oftentimes I think issues of gender, issues of work, particularly in discussions on kind of economic policies, are often sidelined. So it's really a privilege to even present this topic in such a big room, in a plenary session, in a public seminar with everyone present as part of it, right? I always joke that when we talk about gender economics in particular, it's often treated like kitchen economics. It's not necessarily kind of the center, and for us to be centering this conversation today is great. So as Mwangi kind of introduced the topic, this discussion that we're wanting to have here is about the intersecting dynamics of gender, of digitalization, and work. As he mentioned, there have been negotiations around trying to extend labor protections to platform workers, to vulnerable workers in the informal economy, and there's ongoing conversations about formalizing the informal sector. But these discussions are also happening around or coinciding with weakened worker power, declining union membership, and the growing precariousness of work in many regions around the world. At the same time, the effects of the changing nature of work globally have been deeply intertwined with worsening social reproductive crises, posing significant challenges for developing economies and communities around the world. While this is not a new phenomenon, we have seen trends, and I think Ruth will touch on this, of increasing platform work, particularly in emerging market and developing economies. And this has also now brought renewed attention to the concepts of work, the value of labor, but the roles of union in this kind of digital age of capitalism. So what we're trying to do with this topic is to explore the limits of digital capitalism, and also challenge the challenge of extending protections to workers with seemingly, as Mwangi mentioned, contradictory class identities, based on this case study of e-hailing workers in Nairobi. So my contribution, I would say, or my role in this discussion for now, is to try and preface this within the theory, right? We did share some readings on this topic ahead of this presentation. But what stood out to me as I was rereading also this paper by Ruth and colleagues was this idea that, one, this idea of contradictory class identities, so people being workers within this sort of kind of sector of informal or precarious work, but also experiencing different levels of vulnerability within it. But also this idea that, and I think Ruth will also speak on this idea of how do we actually classify these workers, right? So a lot of the literature and the way that work in platforms has been classified has been around this idea of independent contractors, around self-employment, around entrepreneurship. And this has a lot to do as well with how labor is actually valued. But there's also a question, and I think one of the key arguments here is that by extending protections to platform workers, the goal is to also kind of improve kind of the social well-being and health of workers in the sector. And what does that actually mean? What is the role of social reproduction? Where is it taking place now when it is actually not covered by the employers or by the state in many countries, and particularly in the African context? So the way that I'll be approaching this is taking you through some definitions. I understand that not everyone might be on the same page in terms of these concepts, particularly social reproduction theory, particularly this idea of how do we actually value labor, what the mainstream approach has been, but also how this kind of mainstream approach has been critiqued and criticized around the world by feminists, by Black feminist scholars, by African feminist scholars, by Global South scholars. What is their understanding of labor, and how can we build a counter narrative in terms of how do we actually understand the challenge of labor in platforms towards better inclusion and also extending protection to these workers. So the way that I'm approaching this is mainly by trying to locate these worker struggles in the platform economy within the broader discussions about the value of labor, as I mentioned, social reproduction, but also the role of women and the informal economy in economic development. I try to kind of propose an alternative kind of lens of trying to understand these challenges of platform workers, and the approach that I propose here is this kind of decolonial African feminist approach, although I do believe that there's a framework that has been shared with you in the paper, in the case study paper, which is about power resources. And I think this very much aligns with kind of the critiques that are coming from African scholars as well. So with that, then, what is social reproduction? So when we say that we want to improve or increase organization within the informal economy, and also that this would improve social reproduction of workers in platforms, what do we mean by this, right? Some of you might be familiar with this concept, but I think the best one that I've kind of aligned with, at least in my own work, has been the one by Laslet and Brenner, which identifies or understands social reproduction to be the activities and attitudes and behaviors emotions and responsibilities and relationships that are directly involved in the maintenance of life on a daily basis and intergenerationally. And so this includes care-related activities, but it's not only limited to these, such as cooking, cleaning, the collection of water, the collection of fuel, the care of adult and child dependents in the home. And this kind of social reproductive work and care work, because of kind of persistent gender norms, is disproportionately performed by women and girls, and is often unpaid or taking place in the informal economy. And it is directly related to capitalist production processes, although we'll see what kind of the mainstream approach to this has been. We also know that, and given kind of the recent global health and economic crisis, that it has significant implications in terms of the participation of women in the labor market. So if we then look at kind of what the mainstream approach has been to this. And by mainstream, often I'm criticized of just blanketly saying, what is this mainstream or Eurocentric perspectives. But when I use this kind of mainstream, I mean, in terms of kind of orthodox traditions and economic theory, classical and Marxist approaches, understand the value of labor then to be kind of twofold. So on the one hand, representing the human form of labor, which is producing commodities that can be used or exchanged in the market, and the function of this labor being represented as the time or the effort that is expended in the production of such commodities. There is this understanding of kind of labor is only valuable in as much as it is part of the capitalist production process, but in the sense that what you're producing can be bought or sold, right? But there have been critiques of this, right? That not necessarily all of this labor is taking place in manufacturing, for instance. Not all of this labor is being performed by men, for instance, that it might not necessarily be directly related to capitalist production, but it might be maintaining or creating the basis for capitalism itself. But that these theories neglect a lot of the work that's happened, and particularly in the context of developing countries in the Global South, in the context of African economies, where the majority of workers are in many countries informal, although South Africa is an anomaly in this sense. But we do have a big precarious and non-standard sector as well. But also it neglects the role of households, right? So what I mentioned was that around social reproduction, that this is work that is usually taking place at the home and the community level. But it's work that is necessary, right? So if we consider if someone is not cooking or cleaning, or if someone is not taking care of sick people, or if women are not birthing and rearing children, where's this kind of social reproduction, where's labor going to come from, right? But there's a fundamental role that households are playing in maintaining this capitalist system. So in this kind of mainstream approach, then we can argue that the market is overstated, right? Because in kind of classical economics, the understanding is that even the subsistence and social reproduction only takes place within the market, right? You get wages from your work, you go buy the food, but what about in the case that there are no wages, or the wages are so low, but people are still maintaining economies and communities in this sense. So then I kind of bring this forward to, in terms of the kind of critical perspectives, right? So feminists, as I mentioned, have always challenged or asserted the role of women and the contributions of women in economic development. But we know that there's a certain period, even within the social sciences, particularly around the 60s and 70s, where social reproduction was kind of the main focus. And the argument from scholars was that this invisible work that women and households and communities are doing is actually linked to the economy. And so For instance, in their seminal contribution, The Power of Women and the Subversion of Community, Dalla Costa and James make the case that despite popular assertions that domestic work is not productive, the work performed by women in the household should be regarded as social service in as much as it serves the reproduction of labor power in the economy. And that the unwaged condition of housework is actually hiding or masking the labor that actually goes into capitalist production and reinforces the notion that housework is not work. So capital then creates a submissive servant to sustain the social bonds required for its reproduction while denying it any form of monetary value. So capitalism then outsources this. So in the case of platform workers, then you can see that, oh, well, if these people are not treated as or regarded workers, they're regarded independent contractors or self-employed or entrepreneurs, they're not entitled to any kind of legal and social protections, as Ruth will speak to as well. They have to then, who then has to provide this labor? And if we saw, for instance, with the COVID-19 pandemic, many governments were not prepared for the kind of health or the severity of the crisis. A lot of people were not covered. I think there was a report by the ILO that said about 40% of the global population did not have access to healthcare, for instance. So in that case, who's going to be doing this labor? So that then gets outsourced onto workers. It gets outsourced to households and the communities, and capital still benefits from it. And there's been lots of critiques then. I mean, there was a critique again of this critique. So this critique is coming from kind of feminist scholars in the global north, but then Black feminists as well, like Angela Davis and others, still argued with this, saying, well, this idea of kind of wages for housework is also still looking at this kind of white Eurocentric experience. It's not really speaking to the experience of Black people and African societies, where people have not necessarily had the privilege of just being housewives, right? They've had to do both. So the argument is that they are having to both participate in the kind of formal labor market, but they're also having to do this unpaid care work. So how do we account for that? That is also still work. But then social reproduction theory, which has really become kind of popularized in the last, I would say, 10 or so years, has tried to highlight the kind of fundamental role of labor in the creation of the human economy and in the maintenance and continuation of society as a whole. So it contrasts the kind of Marxist traditions by arguing against the distinctions between productive and reproductive labor. And instead, its approach is that both productive and reproductive forms of labor constitute the totality of capitalist political economy. However, unlike other commodities that are produced by labor in the production process, labor itself is produced outside of this process through kin-based social relations, as we mentioned, in the reproductive sphere. And these relations are responsible for the generational reproduction of the working class and the maintenance of labor through a wide range of care-related activities, which we talked about a little earlier. So while this labor is disproportionately performed by women, social reproduction theory differs from earlier feminist movements in that it calls for a broader understanding of social reproduction and the institutions and social relations required for the reproduction of labor in the economy. So the argument is that, in fact, in order to reproduce labor, this work is not only happening only in the homes, but there's also institutions and structure, a structural element to the reproduction of labor that we should also consider. And so obviously this complicates then this mainstream conceptualization of the value of labor, particularly in regard to the productive, reproductive boundaries and the creation of value in the economy. And most critically is the notion that social reproduction does not constitute an exogenous moral value, but an implicit economic value representative of the social relations that have converged to create a function of labor in the economy. So that this labor that is being performed by women, by households, by communities is actually vital for the maintenance of the capitalist system. But Global South scholars have also critiqued this as well. And they develop an argument that, that says that in many regions, wage labor hasn't even kind of been the central part of social reproduction, but that there are other labors, and Sarisha Naidu has written a lot about that. There's other labors that are involved in social reproduction that have nothing to do with capitalism or capitalist production, right? It has nothing to do with wages that you're going to earn, because in some cases there are no wages, or the wages are insufficient for maintaining households and communities, and that we should rather be looking at this labor as a circuit, right? So the labor that is taking place in the subsistence production, looking at non-capitalist commodity production, but also looking at capitalist production. But to bring us now to kind of this case study that we're talking about from the African perspective, I think, you know, kind of African feminist political economy, and I said to Ruth I wasn't going to get into too much detail on this either, but it is important to note that it has coincided with kind of broader discussions and around kind of decolonization and trying to figure out, you know, how would we, I was recently in a meeting earlier this year, trying to think about how would we understand the challenges or economic challenges in Africa, or even the challenges of labor in our context outside of kind of the Eurocentric understanding, or outside of how Western theory has tried to conceptualize these problems. And this is beyond saying, oh, okay, issues around oppression and colonialism, but recognizing that history, but also recognizing that there have been other ways of understanding and other ways of actually organizing society and valuing labor from an African sense that is counter to the problems that we're seeing right now, right? So how was society organized before, you know, colonialism, for instance? How did we consider progress before colonialism and domination and oppression and exploitation, right? What was the role of households? And a lot of the theory that you see from kind of African feminist scholars points to the fact that our organization of and valuing of labor never necessarily, there was a shift, right? From once we started adopting the kind of capitalist modes and once colonialism began, in terms of how we even understood the role of households and the role of women. Everyone had their role to play, and that was valued until, you know, capitalism and colonialism tells us that the labor that is being performed by households is unproductive because it's not generating a profit, because it's not creating use and exchange values. And so in this, then there's this challenge, and if we kind of follow this provocation from African feminist scholars to say, what is our understanding of this based on kind of our own kind of traditional knowledge systems, based on our own experiences, historical experiences of the production process, of how development has even taken place, which have always called for a more intersectional understanding. So we have these three kind of topics, which is gender, digitalization, and work, but we're saying that the experience of platform workers is intersectional in this way, that we can't actually understand vulnerability in the platform economy without also recognizing the challenge of labor within society. And so then if we were to take then, if I say, well, let's try and evaluate this challenge of labor in the platform economy based on an African feminist perspective, we would then see, for instance, that platform work and all forms of informal and precarious work are intersecting with broader historical and structural challenges of labor under capitalism. And that this binary of formal versus informal is more so a spectrum, right? That informality happens within a spectrum, and that formality and informality within the economy are mutually constituting and emerging out of and alongside one another. So African feminists also recognize the challenge of labor in the platform economy then as a problem of asymmetric power, structural, institutional, societal power, but it values social reproduction work as vital for the continuation of life under capitalism, whereas mainstream theories would have said, oh, well, all you need is to earn a wage to survive. But what about in the case that the wages, as I said, are insufficient to, maintain life, to protect life, maintain livelihoods? In this sense, then we would say, well, this is actually more critical than the wage. This work that is happening is more critical than kind of capitalist production for the maintenance and continuation of life. And that basically the workplace structures, what we see in terms of vulnerability of women in platforms is a reproduction of the social system. And that women's vulnerabilities are emerging out of a system that has been premised on exploitation, oppression, domination, in which women are disproportionately vulnerable due to their positions in the social system. And so this suggests that policies should be supporting, social welfare, right? So we should be promoting policies for the expansion of social protections and social services as vital for advancing gender equality, but also for the rights of workers under digital platforms. And so in this, then, to kind of wrap up, the argument is that if we view the challenge of labor under a different lens, that's not only seeing this, the work that is happening, that is maintaining these workers as unproductive, that is not only seeing the labor that is productive as only being in the formal labor market, we might have then a better way of understanding the challenges of labor under this digital capitalism, and also be able to identify the opportunities for building worker power and organizing workers with seemingly contradictory class identities. And so I'm just going to hand over then to Ruth to show us, well, how how has this happened in the case of Nairobi e-hailing workers? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Siviwe, for doing the hard work of establishing the theoretical ground on which we're now going to look at one of the case studies. And I'm really just so honored to be here. I was at APORDE, I think 13 years ago, and it's fun to kind of come back, and I'm looking forward to the engagements with all of you. I think just to pick up on a couple of points from your presentation, I think one of them is, and this is rooted in the Marxist political economy tradition, but is this concern with capitalist development and the recognition that throughout history, capitalist development has hinged on the continuous expansion of the frontiers of accumulation, whether through what David Harvey would call the spatial fix, through, for instance, colonialism, right? The expropriation, exploitation, and exclusion of the majority of the world's people, or now through a technological fix, right? And Ursula Hughes wrote a really interesting book, one of the first books on labor in the digital economy, where she argues that one of the effects of digitalization has been this blurring of the lines between productive and reproductive labor, to the point that we as consumers on Facebook or any of these websites have become a source of profit through not our paid productive labor, but actually our unpaid reproductive labor. In other words, that consumption in the digital age has become a source of accumulation in its own right. Or as Nanjala Nyabola, the Kenyan writer, would say, data is the new oil. Right? I think the second point that I just wanted to pick up on is this idea that capital has never willingly assumed responsibility for workers' social reproduction. They've been made to assume responsibility for particular sectors out of a process of struggle. But too often, those have been formal workers, male workers, white workers, settler workers. In other words, there's been a continuous struggle through the process of capitalist development about who gets what, from whom, and on what terms. And I think what's been so important about the kind of feminist literature has been to expand our sense of who is actually eligible and on what basis. The third one is that digitalization has enabled the reorganization of production, and in many ways swung the pendulum away from some of the historic gains that particular working classes achieved through the process of struggle. Digital companies have been able to take advantage of what is essentially a regulatory black box in order to expand the frontiers of accumulation, reorganize production, and essentially shift the risk of social reproduction entirely back onto the household. So with that, the question arises, well, how do you reverse this? How do you move the pendulum back the other way? And it's in this context that we've started seeing more and more literature discussing this idea of the social compact for platform workers. And so the presentation today will focus some on this and then dig into the Kenyan case, because Kenya has been at the forefront of some of the regulatory experiments. And I hope that there's also colleagues here that can share what their experiences have been, but to kind of think about, well, what can we learn from that experience in terms of thinking about a broader social compact that may swing the pendulum away from the concentration of capital that we've seen. I think it's also important to recognize the context, and Siviwe spoke to this, to questions of unemployment and labor surplus and what that means for our theory making as well. African governments today face, from a policy point, as I'm sure you all know, the difficult task of incorporating an increasingly youthful population into the labor market in a context where we're seeing increased de-agrarianization, but without mass industrialization. And in some instances, people would even argue premature deindustrialization. The hope is that digital technologies, the 4IR revolution, will kickstart this process of structural transformation by increasing productivity, efficiency, competitiveness at the global level, and obviously jobs, ideally decent work. But of course, there is a debate about whether industrial upgrading or technological upgrading does in fact lead to social upgrading, right? And evidence from across sectors suggests that this is not an automatic relationship. And in fact, is the product of policy, it's the product of struggle, and the outcome often represents or reflects the balance of power between competing social forces, between, broadly speaking, capital and labor. And I'm using these broadly, and so not speaking only about industrial labor, but thinking about the term that Issa Shifty terms working people, i.e. people who may still have partial access to the means of production, but rely on the sale of their labor power, at least some of the time, in order to survive. Now, digital labor platforms have been at the forefront of the 4IR revolution on the African continent, though it's not the only mechanism. Obviously, there's machine learning, automation, there's all sorts of mechanisms. But digital labor platforms has been one that has been heavily studied. In particular, what we call location-based platforms. That is, platforms like your e-hailing, delivery services, domestic worker intermediaries, and so on, that are connecting workers and consumers in the same geographic location. And part of the reason why they've been studied more than, let's say, your online-based platforms, like translation, editing, et cetera, is because actually workers on digital labor platforms are visible. They're geographically tethered, and in some ways they have greater structural power than workers that may have higher skills, but be operating in extreme isolation, online, often in the global south, offering services to the global north. In looking at the research that is emerging, we see a couple of things. One is that the proliferation of digital platforms has allowed for the concentration of capital across sectors and geographies. we now have a handful in the e-hailing sector, a handful of companies that control transportation across the globe. It's also resulted in the casualization of work, because these companies, for the most part, don't identify, in the case of e-hailing, for instance, as transport companies. They identify as tech intermediaries, who they claim they're connecting consumers, potential consumers, with people that are offering their service or service providers. And that's been the basis for the classification of platform workers in the e-hailing sector as own account employees, right? These footloose companies also claim, as we'll see with the Kenyan case, that they can't actually be regulated at the national level because they're not actually operating at the national level, despite the fact that that has been successfully contested in court. And so this has allowed companies to skirt all sorts of regulations, from tax to data protection to labor and social protections, and has fast-tracked or has enabled the process of casualization. That said, I think it's also important, and to Siviwe's point, to think about what is different in the trends and experiences of places in the global north and in the global south, between Europe and the African continent, between countries where the majority of the workforce is in permanent employment and countries where the majority of the workforce is actually informally employed. And one of the things that we see is that actually the casualization story on the African continent is not so simple, right? Many of the activities that are being platformized were already informal and casualized. What increases precarity, therefore, is not necessarily the lack of protection alone. It's the combination of the lack of protection and the concentration of power within these platforms. In other words, whereas workers, taxi drivers, for instance, would have had greater autonomy over their labor in a taxi association, today they have no power to decide how much they're going to earn, at what rate, or anything else, right? So what's happened is not so much that just casualization in our standard thinking, but what's happened is a decline in worker power and autonomy over their labor in sectors where previously they might have been informal, but there was some greater autonomy. That said, that's also what offers the possibility. It's precisely this concentration that offers the possibility to make demands from capital. If we think about the debates over informality and formalization over the last 40, 50 years, since the sort of the ILO debates, much of that struggled to make any claims from capital at all. The response was often to make claims on the state. If you think about the recommendation, the ILO recommendation 204 on the formalization of the informal economy, there's some recognition that you should have industrial policy to create jobs. There's some recognition that you need to curb informalization by enforcing labor protections. But a lot of it has to do with how do you improve conditions of the self-employed through increased state support for social protection, for better infrastructure, et cetera. And so a lot of these debates actually struggle to hold capital to account at all, right? Because there was no easy interlocutor. And one of the interesting things about the platform economy and this current negotiation around ILO convention for the platform economy is that it's put the onus squarely back onto capital, because guess what? The platform economy is dominated by a very small number of companies, primarily located in the US, in China, and a few others across the rest of the world. But it does pose challenges, right? And the other challenge that it's posed is this question of revenue, right? If we look at the digital companies, the sort of average taxation rate for digital companies is somewhere around, for corporate taxes, somewhere around 11%, some are 19%, some are 7%. Why? Because countries are competing with each other to attract digital investment, offering fiscal exemptions, right? For under the guise of sort of research and development, while at the same time struggling to collect any tax, because where do you define where it is that value is being produced and where it's being appropriated? So in response to all this, there have been growing calls for this new social compact for platform workers. And there is currently a process of negotiation within the International Labor Organization to establish a normative framework for the platform economy that will deal with at least some of the points around labor rights. But of course, the challenge with establishing any kind of standard setting process is that it's what Kate Mayer, or it involves what Kate Mayer refers to as some degree of social sorting, which decides who is eligible for protection and on what terms. It requires making a group of workers who may have contradictory class positions legible for regulation. And in that process, there's a sort of simplification of their identity. And so while international labor standards are critical, particularly in the platform economy where you have platforms operating across transnationally, at the same time, one has to be attuned to where difference may lie and how you build some level of flexibility to allow for alternative forms of organization of production, right? And so by delineating the moral and legal boundaries between capital and labor, standard setting processes may offer workers greater protection on some points, but foreclose the possibilities for alternative relations of production in others. And I think that around this, we can learn a lot from past debates around formalization of particular sectors, ranging from domestic workers to street traders and so on, because the same questions inevitably arise. What are the risks in making gig workers legible? What are the challenges of defining the contours of rights for workers who, by the nature of the very labor process they've been forced into, may embody contradictory class positions? And what is then the shifting nature of political demands around that? So if we look, and we did a survey in collaboration with the Transport Workers Union in Kenya, where we looked at workers in the transport sector after a regulation had been adopted governing the relations between workers, the platforms, car owners, and customers in Kenya. Now, this was not an ideal regulation in the sense that it did not offer a wide sort of spectrum of rights to workers, but it included what workers had demanded: a commission cap, a due process before being logged off the app, some level of occupational health and safety. And importantly, in the Kenyan case, it also forced these platform companies to register in Kenya, which they disputed. It went all the way up to the Constitutional Court, and they found that the companies did have to register, and to register as transport companies, which then made them put them under the sort of regulatory agency of the National Transport and Safety Authority, which then began to exercise its power and to promote its own version of collective bargaining. So even if you don't assume kind of the standard worker-employer relation, there are ways in which national government institutions can play an important role in kind of brokering, right, negotiations, and in that way, taking away power from algorithmic management. Now, in Kenya, and our survey focused specifically on Nairobi and Mombasa, which are the kind of two hubs of where there were of the e-hailing sector, most e-hailing workers are defined as the primary breadwinner, both women and men. What's interesting is to think about sort of what are the dynamics. So most men in the survey were married, and most women were not. They were either single or widowed or divorced. And their story of entry into the platform economy was often one that was driven by some moment of crisis. Another interesting difference is that most of the women in the survey had a college degree, whereas most men didn't. And I think we've seen that also in other sectors, precarious sectors, where women are often better educated than men, but aren't able to find positions, the same positions as men in their equivalent sort of educational level, because of all the barriers that women face in accessing the labor market. And yet what it also means, in a contradictory way, is that women tend to be car owners. and to hire other men as drivers. So they tended to be better off than the average man, right, in the survey. Because they had more resources that they brought to the table. Prior to joining the e-hailing sector, many of them worked in the transportation sector, women in commerce and trade, or other services, beauty, ICT. There were some workers that gave up their positions in the formal sector when the e-hailing business first started, because they not only could earn better, but they had greater autonomy over their labor, or they hoped for that. E-hailing is the main income source for both women and men, but they often also engage in other activities, side hustles, as one does generally in the economy. Their top concerns were low rates, despite the regulation, and promotional discounts, high commissions and elusive pricing structures by the platforms, lack of safety and harassment, long working hours, ratings and surveillance, which make it very difficult for them to actually affect any autonomy, right? To cancel rides if they aren't, enough, or to refuse rides if it's not sufficient, because their ratings go down, and that has an impact then on them being able to access future work, or they can even be kicked off the app. High operational costs. They have to assume not only all the investment costs, all the operational costs, but they also are heavily indebted. And in fact, one of the things that emerged from this was this idea of debt as a strategy of labor control. Workers get coerced into long hours. They are unable to go on strike for extended periods of time because they've been trapped in this debt trap that's facilitated by the marriage between fintech and big tech, right? So this platform model is not particularly lucrative for workers. And in order to resolve this contradiction, what's happened over time is that companies like Uber have partnered with fintechs under the guise of democratizing the mobility industry. But of course, that means that workers now have to earn enough to pay back these loans. And fintechs, in partnership with big tech, are able to actually garnish workers' wages. So this is another dimension of what we need to regulate, is not only the labor rights, social protection, data, taxation, and so on, but it's actually what are all these intermediaries that are making money off of this ultimately unsustainable business model. And so to maximize income, workers, and protect themselves from the punitive practices of platforms, workers end up working on multiple platforms or multi-apping. And while that may be sort of a way of exercising some control, it's ultimately not transforming their conditions of work. That said, there is a lot of worker organization taking place. And in Kenya, that takes place through a combination of zones. So workers kind of associate via WhatsApp and groups. They then may join associations that play a more sort of clearly political role in engaging Kenyan politics. They may have welfare groups that offer some level of mutual aid during moments of crisis and loans. Cooperatives that emerge. Also, in East Africa, you have the SACCO model, which allows workers to invest in an activity that's not related with their income generating activity, but their primary one, but would provide an important source of income otherwise. And then now the trade unions, which are trying to shift their own organizing models to engage with this group. And so the article that you received to read is about the messiness of that, right? This is not a sort of direct process, partially because you have all of these different types of forms of organization, which are themselves the product of the murkiness of workers' own classification. And then these contradictory identities, which workers have to assume. They are worker, but they also are employer because they've been forced to be an employer and absorb those risks. And as a result, organizing in the sector is very difficult, or winning victories in the sector is very difficult. Now, we were quite interested in trying to understand, because there's a lot of debate in the regulation of the platform economy. Are they self-employed? Are they would they support reclassification as workers? And one of the interesting things was that overwhelmingly, yes, workers identified as self-employed because they didn't have a contract, as simple as that. But one shouldn't take that identification to mean that that is what they aspire to. And what's interesting in the Kenyan case is that although they saw themselves as self-employed, and that's how they mobilized around the regulation, when they realized that the regulation offered very little protection, one's identity shifted, right? And so by the time we were interviewing them, 91% of women, and this is sort of counterintuitive, said that they would support their reclassification as worker, and 86% of men said the same, because clearly self-employed was not enough of a category for political claim making. They were opposed to the idea of time limits, overwhelmingly. I mean, many recognize that the hours were too long and so on, but without improved salary, that was going to be, having an 8-hour workday doesn't make any sense because it doesn't guarantee you enough income in order to meet your reproductive needs. In terms of wage setting, there was support for, the majority of the people surveyed did support some level of minimum income, although there was a question about what that would be, but felt that that should be decided through a collective bargaining forum. In other words, by introducing collective bargaining, you're able to take away control from algorithmic management because you define some minimum standards. What makes it possible to have algorithmic management is not just digitalization, it's the absence of any kind of standard at all or any process to achieve that through the agency of the people involved. What was interesting was that most of the people surveyed didn't think that this collective bargaining should happen with unions involved at all. There was a sense that unions were political, and instead, one of the reasons they supported their reclassification was so that they could get away from the union and have instead some relationship to the state. So they thought, yes, we'd like to have the National Transport and Safety Authority, the e-hailing partners, us, right? But not necessarily some kind of intermediary. And that was, of course, a concern for our partner, the Transport Workers Union. And again, there was quite a lot of ambivalence vis-a-vis the union, particularly among women, because the unions in the transport sector have been primarily male-dominated. One last thing I want to point out is also this tension around social protection. I've done a lot of work on social protection. There's always the sense that social protection is really important. And it's not that it wasn't relevant to workers, but when we asked about their primary considerations, it was really at the bottom. And in the Kenyan case, where you also have a national health fund or a national health insurance fund, that seemed a lot more urgent. I think that there's a sense in which health and not being able to access health services then induces workers to contribute more actively. But Social Security was really something, particularly where you have a weak Social Security apparatus or social insurance structure. It really wasn't one of the primary concerns. And I think that raises questions about whether you can have weak voluntary Social Security schemes for informal workers, or how do you actually expand social protection? So to end, towards a social compact, I think that the important message is that the outcome of technological innovation is neither linear nor predetermined. It really depends on policy choices, worker organization, and social dialogue. In regulating the platform economy, it's important to wrestle with workers' contradictory aspirations and positions. And these aren't just positions that are rooted in false consciousness, which I think is, what the historic kind of trade unionist approach was. It's based on the contradictions of how it is that the labor process itself is structured, the kinds of risks they have to absorb, the kinds of strategies they need to adopt in order to make a living in this casualized. So casualization itself breeds, I guess, parts of these contradictions. Women, this was interesting to us, shared many of the same concerns as men, but they experience specific forms of gender discrimination, harassment, and violence in the workplace. And they also have to deal, of course, with the double, triple burden, right, of paid and unpaid work. And one of the surprising findings in our survey, which was corroborated by another survey in Kenya by Dr. Jacob Omolo, is that women actually work longer hours than men on average, because they are working the least profitable hours, because the most profitable hours are either the most dangerous hours for women, or they are hours when women are actually taking their children to school, putting their children to bed, and so on. And so this idea that somehow flexibility allows women to work fewer hours actually did not show up in the survey, and I think it challenges some of our prevailing sort of conceptions. Interestingly, women are, yes, excluded from traditional male unions, but they also hold special forms of what we call societal power that are rooted in their alliance and membership in other kinds of civil society formations, including feminist organizations. So they have been able, in the Kenyan case, to expand the sources of alliance of the Transport Workers Union beyond simply sort of their traditional group. And obviously, you know, if unions are able to effectively represent platform workers, women workers, they have to figure out ways to adopt not only their structures, their organizing strategies, but also how it is that they represent workers. And this is a messy process, as the article we shared shows. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so very much for this wonderful talk that brings to light the kind of challenges that our societies face today in terms of workers, their relationship to reproducing themselves and their relationship to surplus value. We have time for questions, both from the online group and those here. And I don't know if you would like to take a number at a time, maybe 2 to 3, and then answer those in rounds. Is that rather than? So we'll start here.
Thank you. My name is Binga Sanusi. Thank you very much for the beautiful presentations. Mine is just a simple one. I just want to ask, what gives the women the leverage? Because in the result you presented, it appears we have more female than male. So I'm wondering, what leverage do they have in Kenya for their population to be more than male in terms of the e-hailing? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Ndombi. My question was to find out if you were able to look at some of the other, or discuss with the women some of the other challenges that they experience outside, well, within the e-hailing business, but in terms of sourcing out resources. So, for example, how they would go about, if there are any challenges in going about to finance, you know, their vehicles, and what were the challenges there, and if you could, if you were able to ascertain what the difference is in terms of the experience between them, women and men, and also just, of course, the issue of safety. If they experienced any of, you know, how they were able to circumvent or create some form of security boundaries for themselves, and a community to be able to deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, both the theoretical background and the case study. So, okay, my name is Hassan Nasir. I'm from Nigeria. I work in Rwanda. So, considering the exploitative nature of, so considering the fact that unpaid care work kind of reinforces the exploitative nature of the capitalist economy, do you think that pushing for a legalization of care work would be a quantum leap in the whole quest to to avoid such exploitation. For example, there could be some form of solidarity campaign to legalize care work. So women will be at the liberty to refuse the payment. So I don't know if that makes sense, but just a form of legalizing care work of legalizing it in terms of wages. That care work should be part of the constitution, that it should be paid. Then it's just like the women will have the right of first refusal. I think that will solve it from the constitutional point view, right? So I'm struggling to construct it properly, but I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say. Thanks.
Okay. While Ruth organizes the responses for the e-hailing, I think I'll respond to the last one. There have been many campaigns around, I think I had touched a little bit on it, I think in the 60s and 70s, the wages for housework movement, advocating for this work to be paid, given its value. I think the counter argument, and people, there is still kind of movements around this, but I think the argument around trying to pay or create a price, I think, for social reproduction or care work, is that not all of this is something that can be quantified. So not all social reproduction work can be quantified. So if you remember the definition that I showed earlier, it wasn't only speaking to activities like, cooking and cleaning, which in certain cases, as I mentioned, happens both in the paid and unpaid labor market. But there's other activities, maintaining social relations, the emotional side of social reproduction as well. That is actually something that you're not actually able to put a number on. And so I think this is the thing that's been challenging. I think the bigger effort has been to try and say, or at least to counter the arguments around how do we value progress in the economy as going beyond just GDP as well, as to say, okay, well, there is all of this labor that is taking place that is also valuable, that is also indicative, as I mentioned, in the history of our own contexts of progress that isn't related to the capitalist system. And I think that has gained better traction, because if we only count some activities and we're only able to pay for some activities that are related to social reproduction, there's a lot that will still be hidden in the cracks on that side. But yeah.
Thanks. So the majority of e-hailing drivers are men, although there are a growing number of women. And I think it's quite interesting that platforms have been able to break what was one of the sectors that was the hardest to enter. One of the people we interviewed said, before these digital labor platforms, e-hailing companies came, you could lose your life fighting over territory in the taxi industry. I mean, this is not an easy industry. And it was an industry that was mostly, the women struggled to get into it all. So there is a case to be made that the platformization of certain activities has allowed certain marginalized groups to access these activities in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. And you do see a growing number of women, and you see platforms, you see women-only platforms in Kenya like Anisa, and you see platform companies now also catering to women, so allowing, for instance, they also do it in South Africa, to have a woman-only tick box, right? And of course, they waste no time saying that this is part of women's economic empowerment, even though it's extremely, exploitative conditions. But still, the majority of workers are men. So those percentages are just in relation. We then disaggregated to try to see where are there similarities and where are there differences in terms of people's identities, perceptions, demands, et cetera. In terms of financing, I think we were quite surprised, and this is partially because women are probably, the women in the sample are sort of started off on average in a better socioeconomic position, right? So they're more highly educated, et cetera. So a significant number of women use their own savings to actually invest. Others, it was actually the formal financial banking sector. But other important source of financing, specifically in Kenya as in other parts of East Africa, are the saving and credit cooperatives, which we don't really have in South Africa or in Southern Africa. We have stokvels, but we don't have this kind of cooperative structure, as well as in some cases the chamas, which are kind of like stokvels. I think the next piece of research that we're going to do is actually looking specifically, because this was done before the mass entry of fintechs into the e-hailing sector. I think now it would look a little bit different. And so wanting to explore what the role of e-hailing is. In terms of the kinds of, yes, sexual violence is a major, I mean, taxi industry in general is extremely dangerous. It's one of the most dangerous sectors to work in for both men and women. But women have the added challenge of sexual violence. And that's something that they really struggled with and that the platform companies didn't respond to, and neither did the unions. So when the Women's Association, there was a Women's Association that agreed to join the union, but as an association rather than individual members. And when they joined, they said, one of the things we want is a women's desk. And when they were asked what the priorities were, it was self-defense training. It was, learning what weapons you can carry that are legal, but that will protect you, as well as strategies. In the absence of a sort of clear response, women do things like try to leverage the public space. So they would talk about, for instance, being sexually harassed by a client who thinks that by virtue of them driving at night, they are interested sexually in the client, and they would go to a gas station, right? So women are always constantly looking at the public spaces and trying to figure out who within those spaces might be potential allies. But yeah, it's a dangerous profession.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we go for another round of questions? So we have one here, two here.
Good evening, ladies. Thank you for your presentations. My question is really general. I'm focusing on the rethinking African in this APORDE thing. Like, with everything you are saying, don't you think all industrial or reindustrializing or e-commerce policies in the country should be specifically and intentionally gender biased with that concern there? Because I'm thinking that if you're telling me that there are more women, more educated women in Kenya getting more involved in e-hailing, it means they're not getting any other opportunities, and they probably are out there trying to make a living for their children. And in the context of coming from the 2008-2010 economic crisis, COVID, and now we are dealing with AI and climate change, isn't it time that all industrial and economic policy, whether it's e-hailing, whichever sector it is, must be intentionally biased towards women, so that if a woman wants to look after her children, she'll know that she has enough money, either government subsidies or grants and things like that. But it must be built in so that we account for those hours that the women lose economically if they can't operate because it's unsafe.
Yeah, good evening to both of all of you, and thanks for the wonderful discussion so far. Now, my thought is on, I'm struggling here because when we talk of digitalization of the e-hailing space, now I'm trying to look at a time before e-hailing and to see maybe a comparison of what income was like for drivers, both male and female, before that time. And now that there is a platform that in a sense is almost, what's the best way? It's almost like a standard way. So you don't need to be in a particular turf. You don't need to pay to a particular chairman or whatever the case may be to be able to drive your vehicle in that area. Does this not give a fair platform for people to be able to earn a living that might be better than what was available before that time? Because it seems to me that I can understand from the macro perspective that we might see that the government or whoever gets the revenue from these unions are not getting them anymore, and it's going to some platform that might not be registered in the national economy, or as in the case of Kenya, they were able to fight it. But for the everyday driver, for the individual, are they not better off under e-hailing than before? I'm asking, I'm not sure.
Okay, we also have a couple of questions from online. The first one asks, what about men? There are many reports of men found dead in their cars because of exhaustion and locking themselves in their cars. The second question is, what is your comment from Uber Boda Boda, now in the same market space and way cheaper? What is your comment from, or I assume also about, Uber Boda Boda, now in the same market space and way cheaper?
Okay. Yeah, so I think I'll respond, I think, to the question about is it gender mainstreaming in economic policies, I guess. I think for a while, even if we look at, you know, our own policies in South Africa, there has been an effort in terms of including at least language around gender or recognition of gendered inequalities and policies. And I think one thing that I have been discussing, I think recently as well, has been the need to go beyond that. I think to Ruth's points as well, a lot of the policies around even empowerment of women are still operating within the same capitalist framework that is based on the exploitation of all workers, but also of women based on their positions as well. And I think the need, there's a need for policies to go beyond that. I think feminist political economy does try to analyze both the challenges differently through more innovative approaches. That isn't just about, okay, how do we measure, how do we count the number of women, how do we assess this from, you know, men versus women, etc. But also to the conversation about social reproduction as well. What is it that we are actually counting, right? How do we actually value labor? I think that would make the policies go a little bit further than where they are now, where they've really just focused on just the inclusion of women in the space, but haven't really transformed the experiences of women in the labor market, but also in society more broadly. And I think there are kind of alternative, or at least attempts to develop, as I mentioned, a counter narrative around these arguments based on our own kind of traditional knowledge systems, but also on our understanding of our own context and the needs and the challenges of our societies beyond that. To the point of gender then, if we're saying we're trying to be more kind of gender aware, the need is for the policies that we have, or at least to have some frameworks for accountability, for ensuring that things are changing beyond just saying women need more jobs, or we need to include more women in the space, when we know that even based on this case study, the experiences of women, even as owners, women might still be vulnerable within this kind of same space. I think there needs to be a little bit more innovation in terms of the kinds of policies that we're creating beyond just operating within the framework and just saying and women within that, or let's prioritize women or include more women within that.
So maybe I'll start backwards and go forwards. What about the men? And I think the example that was given online of men sleeping in their cars while multi-apping, usually, on multiple apps, because they get shut off on one, but are trying to make enough money under the system. And so then join a different app and are catching sleep in between and sleeping in their cars. That is a clear example that this crisis of social reproduction is not one that affects only women. And men are very much embedded in that. And I think that that's an important point, both empirically, but also theoretically, in how it is that we kind of understand these questions. And the boda example, which they've now introduced in South Africa, and it's quite interesting because South Africa doesn't really have a culture of riding on the back of motorcycles as transportation. That's much more common in East Africa and sort of Southern East Africa. And it's been introduced in South Africa, and I'm curious to see where it goes. But it's an example of Uber and other e-hailing companies constantly innovating. They're constantly tinkering with their model to figure out how it is that they can maximize profit, and to do so in ways that sort of extend, right, the frontiers once again of accumulation, extend the number of people that are involved, both in terms of the drivers and the customer bases. What were the conditions before and after? And I think your point is an important one, which is, is it so clear cut to say that prior to platformization conditions were good? I think certainly the rates were higher. They were decided through the powerful taxi associations. There was often quite a lot of exploitation in that, because those who owned the right to drive the taxis were not necessarily the drivers. So there were powerful interests that didn't always trickle down to the drivers, but there was a sort of greater autonomy on one level. Although there is a question about whether the drivers themselves in the taxi industry benefited from that autonomy. Today, there are some benefits. So there's a study that just came out based in Dar es Salaam, where it says, well, now drivers don't need to haggle. And actually, that's quite nice to say the price is set by the app. We go or we don't go, or you can haggle around it. But there's something about that actually improves the working conditions. The working conditions are not just about the wages, and that it also adds a level of respectability to an activity because of how securitized it is, that has allowed drivers to access neighborhoods and social lives that they might have previously not had access to. So I think from an anthropological point of view, it's not so clear cut as regulators point out. And I think, to that point, I just wanted to take a step back away from platforms for a second and think a little bit about the first question that was around AI, because I think that what we've seen, and some of my colleagues have done research in South Africa in the auto industry and in mining and so on, in banking as well, is that there's a kind of conflation between digitalization and outsourcing and casualization that existed before. And so where technological upgrading is used as a foil to drive a process of outsourcing that was already underway. And so, for instance, in Mozambique, we see this in the banking sector, where the digitalization of the banking sector has actually been about moving core activities outside of financial services, which have some of the strongest collective bargaining agreements and minimum wage protections, and moving these activities to workers that are defined as call center operators and that have almost no collective bargaining or union representation. So then it begs the question, is this really about digitalization, or is this simply another strategy of casualization? We've also done some research looking at projections based on the quarterly labor force survey of tasks that might be easily automatable. And I think the evidence there is quite scary, because we see that the sectors, particularly for South Africa, but also we saw a similar sort of outcome in Brazil, that are most vulnerable to automation are sectors where women, and in particular Black women, have benefited from increased employment since the end of apartheid. And those are like banking, for instance, right? And those have been important sources of upward mobility also, and kind of the transformational agenda, right? So what happens when the sectors are sectors that actually affect some of the most vulnerable groups and undermine any attempt to, back to your question around transformation?
So it seems we are coming to a close, but I have some questions. So I'm going to take the advantage of being chair to ask some questions or comment. One, I was very interested in this idea of taking a decolonial feminist position. And so if you're going to take a decolonial feminist position, I would like you to talk a little bit about then taking on board the idea of informality and the way informality itself recenters a Western view of late development. So you've now put us in this special case where, it's mal développement, right? So by using the term informality, and it also puts us in this position where then the answer is formalization. So I would like you to consider that and think about how do you decolonize that rather than just falling into what I think is a trap there. The other is local institutional context. I think you kind of both only touched a little bit on SACCOs and the particular framework that they allow for different kinds of organization. And I think it would be interesting to explore that further, because it's not only here that they're used, the government also uses them. So for example, if we take the example of the matatu sector, which is equivalent to what you call the public taxi sector in South Africa. So these are the minibuses used for public transportation. In that sector, the routes are regulated through a SACCO rather than through kind of individual registration, right? They're self-regulated by a SACCO, but you have to be a member of the route SACCO to be on the route. So to think about these alternative formations and how do those allow us to actually rethink the economy and organizing and providing better conditions for workers in the economy. Third, I wonder, and this may be future research, is there a difference in the outcomes with the female platforms, with Anissa or Lady Cab? Do those change outcomes for women, or is it the same? Lastly, I would encourage some look at alternative theories of thinking about contradictory class positions. Particularly here, I think something that can help make it less discretionary is tracing surplus value. Who appropriates a surplus value, who controls it, and how is it distributed? And that does not have to be fixed. So instead of thinking of class as a noun, think of class process. Think of class as a verb. Okay. We'll give them a couple of seconds at least to let themselves close, so I'm not the last word.
Okay. And thank you for challenging even the terminology that we use, right? I think it's a good point that you make. I think many scholars, people like Vandana Shiva, Wangari Maathai, have talked about even our understanding of development and the criticism, right, that we've been kind of brought into this capitalist project that we see does not necessarily serve everyone. But we're also told that our own development is underdevelopment or, maldevelopment in this case. And I think there is that in both trying to figure out, how would we understand these problems that we're facing, also recognizing when we talk about valuing this work, recognizing it in the way that it has historically existed within the context, which isn't through the lens of informal, right? It's, for instance, in the case of market women, market workers, they've historically existed on the continent, and they've been the source of, a livelihood. That work has been a source of livelihoods, but also of subsistence, of maintaining our societies, in not in a non-development way. I think there is a challenge, I think, when you're trying to look at kind of alternative frameworks, but also within the context of this very orthodox training at the same time, but also that prioritizes the language of the global north in trying to understand our problems. And I take that point in as part of that challenge of how do we value labor and informal work not necessarily being informal. I think you also speak to the point of, given these conversations that are happening, I mean, the conversation about formalizing the informal economy has really been challenged even by, advocates in the space because of how it ends up absorbing workers within workers who have operated outside, I guess, this kind of capitalist system within the system for further exploitation. And I think the points that Ruth has brought here is that if we recognize that there are different needs, even within, certain sectors and certain groups of workers, that not all of that might kind of regulation might be the thing more than it is this question about formalization, if I'm making sense, right? Whereas formalization would be about, okay, how do we tax the informal economy, which is really the conversation, and we've seen this in a lot of countries and the work that I do with informal workers. The question is about how do we actually, how these people are benefiting from the state, how do we actually make sure that they're actually paying for services that we found, actually a lot of studies say that they don't actually benefit even from kind of public services. But the question then is about, maybe the conversation should be about, these are workers that have always existed within this context, and maybe the question isn't necessarily about formalizing, but regulating for the benefit of the worker rather than of capital, than we've seen so far.
Thanks, Prof. Mwangi, for reminding that sort of an analysis of class is perhaps better done by analyzing process and not identities. And it's interesting because I share that as an idea, but I often get dragged into these sort of research conundrums and find myself having gone somewhere else entirely. So I really appreciate it, and I think it's how you design the research. It's a function a little bit of the research design and the types of research questions one asks. And I think that for further research, that's a very useful challenge. I think I won't say much about SACOs. I'll read other work and sort of dig deeper. But I think it does raise a question around ownership and control, which is ultimately what much of this debate has been on. And it's an urgent debate because of the concentration of capital across sectors and geographies. So for instance, where you have these alternative platforms, and Kenya has a lot of them, alternative platforms that have emerged, but that have struggled even where they have a relationship with Safaricom and these linkages actually with established large multinational companies that have significant public financing, which is essential, they still struggle to gain a sufficient market share. And you end up in this process where both customers and workers end up going to the larger companies that benefited from first entrant advantage because they've been able, through the exploitation of the data they've collected for the last 10 years, to develop powerful apps that provide rapid service. So I think there's a really, and now apparently Gauteng province wants to establish its own e-hailing app. And, you know, there's a question about what kind of regulation then has to come into effect to support that as part of industrial policy or policy to promote domestic companies. And I think that looking at the SACO model would be really useful. So I think I'll leave it there. And thank you so much for the excellent question.
Thank you so much to all of you.